And move on now to our next speaker, and we're so happy to have Emily Moran Barwick. She is an animal liberation activist, educator, writer, artist, international speaker. And after completing her Master of Fine Arts, Emily founded Bite-Sized Vegan upon the belief that everyone deserves access to solid factual information on issues impacting our health, our planet, society, and the lives of other sentient beings. And through her website, bitesizedvegan.org, Emily provides free educational videos, essays, e-courses, and resources on all aspects of veganism, helping people to go vegan, equipping vegans with tools to get active, and she has a wonderful section on the humane myth. So that's why we invited her here today. Emily, it's all you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to be a part of this. So today I wanted to talk about the importance of language in activism, specifically covering some of the potential pitfalls, distractions, diversions, and counterproductive traps that we can fall into as activists, or just as vegans communicating with non-vegans in our life. So the most dangerous of all of these are often wrapped in the guise of making veganism more approachable. In our efforts to increase the accessibility of veganism, we may inadvertently compromise our convictions and soften our ethics. So offering gradations of change or incremental reduction in animal product consumption or humane alternatives. And, this is often born from the belief that we must either take a firm, even militant or polarizing, or a soft and conciliatory approach to our outreach. But that's really a false dichotomy. The real challenge is walking the line of staying firm in our convictions and uncompromising in our message, while still helping people to lower their guards enough to listen, hear, and make the connection. So within the vegan movement, a major approach that activists take is the social normalization of veganism. What I mean by that is making a vegan lifestyle accessible, affordable, easy, and even mainstream. And, this is a very logical tactic, especially when considering that one of the strongest deterrents to going vegan is social ostracism or rejection from friends and family. And I am the last person to decry the accessibility of veganism. It's something about which I am intensely passionate, and it's one of the foundational aspects of Bite-Sized Vegan. But sometimes in attempting to bridge the gap and to meet the general public where they're at, there exists this risk of reducing the ethical imperative of veganism to a socially acceptable lifestyle choice. And this is why it is so vital that we be mindful of our language choices, lest we end up advocating the very things that we are fighting against. And as I said before, a very common approach that activists and vegans take to provide an entry point into veganism is encouraging people to reduce their intake of animal products. So an example is meat-free Mondays. And such an incremental option is obviously more palatable to non-vegans. It allows them to make a minor change while still providing the emotional benefit of doing something good. But it's also equally alluring for activists. Perhaps we're afraid of coming across as extreme, and we want to provide a less intimidating suggestion. Perhaps we ourselves are intimidated to ask for something like so big as going fully vegan. And perhaps we believe that any change is better than no change at all. While it's understandable for such fears and beliefs to arise, we must take a step back and recognize their implications. Believing that going fully vegan is too much to ask is simply reinforcing that misconception. And offering gradations of change, in essence, endorses the idea that there are acceptable levels of cruelty. So when I spoke in Dublin, I met Sandra Higgins, the founder of Eden Farmed Animal Sanctuary in Ireland, who is also a psychologist. And I remember her making this rather apt analogy, saying something along the lines of that if she had a patient who was beating his wife or his children, she would never advise him to try to reduce the frequency of his violence or stop beating his wife and children on Fridays. The message has to be that violence is always unacceptable and it has to be eradicated. So when we take this approach of reductionism, we're not only doing a disservice to the animals, but we're also to the non-vegans. We are deciding for them that they can't handle the full truth. We're deciding for them that they can't or won't make the decision to go vegan. Now, I find that this is similar to the way in which the American Heart Association approached its official dietary recommendations, which is called the DASH diet, which stands for Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension. While there were decades of research that have demonstrating that consuming animal products is highly significantly associated with elevated blood pressure, the DASH diet still includes dairy and meat. And some of you may be familiar. In his book, How Not to Die, Dr. Michael Greger explained why this is the case, saying, and this is a quote from him, "The reason the DASH diet was modeled explicitly after vegetarian diets, but was not meat-free itself, might surprise you. The primary design goal of the DASH diet was to explicitly create eating patterns that would have the blood pressure lowering benefits of a vegetarian diet, yet contain enough animal products to make them palatable to non-vegetarians. The doctor who chaired the DASH diet committee had even shown that the more dairy vegetarians consumed, the higher their blood pressure appeared to rise. But he figured there was no point in calling for a diet he believed few would follow. This is a recurring theme in official dietary recommendations. And still, instead of simply telling you what the science shows and then letting you make up your own mind, experts patronize the population by advocating what they think is practical rather than ideal. By making the decision for you, they undermine those willing to make even greater changes for optimal health." And so in the very same way to that, when we preemptively offer non-vegans gradations of change rather than the entirety of the truth, we are depriving them of the opportunity, and I believe the right, to have all of the facts and to make the decision for themselves. The same holds true for what I believe to be the most insidious pitfall for activists and non-vegans alike: humane labels and animal welfare regulations. So humane labels and concepts have easily gained a stronghold because they appeal to all sides. For the vegan who's afraid of coming across as militant, they provide a more approachable suggestion to offer. For the activist fighting for animal liberation, they give the possibility of better conditions, progress towards the ultimate goal. And certainly for the non-vegan, who now has a way to keep doing exactly what they want to do, but feel good about it. It can sound odd coming from an animal rights activist, but I find that humane labels and animal welfare regulations are often detrimental to animals. In fact, the entire concept of animal welfare is antithetical to animal rights. Welfare regulations are designed to spare animals any unnecessary suffering, the unspoken implication being that some suffering is necessary when it benefits humans. But still, even if animal liberation is the ultimate goal, isn't there value in improving the conditions for those currently in our systems of exploitation? While this thought process is also understandable, we must again take an honest look at what welfare regulations actually mean for the beings that they are designed to protect. So, a striking example of the true impotence of welfare regulations is the battery cage ban within the European Union. So in 1999, the Council of the European Union set a directive that banned all bear and battery cages by 2012. And while the media at the time focused on the end of battery cages in the EU, what the directive actually did was replace barren battery cages with enriched battery cages, which meant furnished. So yes, hens would now be provided more space and giving furnishings like perches and laying nests, which is certainly an improvement over barren cages. But while these reports extolled how the hens are now going to be afforded 750 square centimeters rather than the 550 square centimeters in conventional battery cages, they neglected to clarify that because of the furnishings, only 600 square centimeters would be usable. And I know that's a lot of numbers, and it probably doesn't mean anything in like just thinking of what that looks like. But in practical terms, in the end, this revolutionary step forward for the rights of these laying hens actually granted them less than a single playing card of additional space. What makes that even more maddening is in 2012, over 12 years after the directive, 13 member states had still failed to comply with this ban. But, as the media is celebrating this victory for animal welfare, the public eats more and more eggs because they're reassured by these higher standards. Meanwhile, the individuals that this entire charade was supposed to be for remain just as exploited. And the execution of this barren battery cage ban is far from a single failing. In 2001, the European Union outlawed gestation crates. And if you're not familiar, those are single sow enclosures constructed of metal bars with hard flooring in which mother pigs are confined during their pregnancies. As always, though, this ban came with ample fine print exceptions and over a decade for implementation. Once again, 12 years later, 9 member states had still failed to comply with the ban. And the thing that's amazing about all of this is several of the member states that failed to implement the battery cage and or the gestation crate bans are rated amongst the best countries in the world for animal welfare. So, as alluring of the idea of better conditions for animals may be, animal welfare legislation is based upon the presumption that we have the right to use non-human animals for our own purposes. So rather than condemn the breeding, enslavement, mutilation, and slaughter of sentient beings, welfare legislation simply codifies precisely how we may breed, enslave, mutilate, and slaughter them. So another example, in 2007, the European Union historically declared non-human animals legally sentient, deserving freedom from hunger, thirst, discomfort, pain, injury, disease, fear, distress, and mental suffering. Having recognized their capacity to feel the same emotions and sensations as we do, the EU, on the back of this, proceeded to draft landmark legislation for their humane treatment. And the resulting council regulation was and is still viewed as another victory for animals. For those of us in countries without regulations, it's natural to think that the systemic abuse of farmed animals results, at least in large part, from a total lack of oversight. In the United States, for example, there are no federal laws governing the treatment of animals in our food industry. We do have the Animal Welfare Act of 1966, but like so many animal welfare acts around the world, it excludes animals raised for food, as do the majority of state anti-cruelty regulations. Now, many US activists and organizations stress the need for regulations to end such atrocities as routine mutilations without anesthetic, the maceration, meaning the grinding up of male chicks in the egg industry, or the blunt force euthanasia of piglets, often pointing to the European Union as a shining example. However, within the EU legislation and supplemental documents, those very same atrocities are not decried, they're codified. So instead of male baby chicks being ground up alive because there are no regulations to stop it, they are ground up alive because regulations declare it to be the preferred method for male chick disposal. There are even detailed specifications for blade speed and sharpness to avoid gumming up the works of the machine. So, we like to think that humane regulations are driven by what's best for the animals, but the animal products industries are industries. They're profit driven. A preliminary report for the EU legislation found that while gassing the estimated 335 million day-old male chicks killed in the EU annually would cost about 1.6, 1.7 million euros, the cost of using, quote, rotating or whirling knives, which are mincing the chicks in a split second, can be considered not to be substantial. So the decision had nothing to do with what was most humane. It was simply a matter of what was cheapest. Now, the maceration of baby chicks has been exposed time and again in undercover footage, which brings me to another pitfall I wanted to address: the presentation of undercover exposés. While I do believe that undercover footage is of vital importance in the fight for animal liberation, we must be mindful of the framing and the presentation. When it comes to undercover exposés, it's often what's not said that's the most damaging. You know, every time that undercover footage has captured workers from one country or another tossing live baby chicks into a grinder, news outlets dramatically recount this unbelievable cruelty. And every time, the public is appalled, outraged, and disgusted. And every time, they assume it's an isolated incident of extreme cruelty. And they continue to eat eggs, confident that they're not supporting that kind of brutality. The most important message of all is left unsaid: that this is not a barbaric practice isolated to corrupt, abusive facilities or industrialized farms. That the grinding up of babies is a welfare regulation. It's the worldwide standard practice. The fact that the lines between overt abuse and standard industry practice are so indistinguishable highlights the absurdity of animal welfarism and humane concepts. So in my essay, The Harm of Humane, from the book Vegan Voices, I opened with a specific example of this, actually from my home state where I live, Iowa. So in September 2008, an undercover video documented routine abuse at an Iowa pig breeding facility, and it made international news. The footage in the investigators' notes captured workers kicking and beating pregnant pigs with metal objects. They were sexually violating them with metal rods, and they were also shown cutting off the tails and tearing out the testicles of piglets without anesthetic, and slamming sick and deformed piglets against the ground, leaving them to die slowly, piled on top of one another in giant bins. While these acts of cruelty were exposed by vegan activists, the egregiousness of the abuse sparked outrage, rightfully, from meat-eating consumers. The food company supplied by the farm, Hormel, received over 10,000 calls in 2 days. And the Associated Press covered this, and in their article, a Hormel spokesperson called the abuse completely unacceptable. And the farm's owner emphasized that we condemn these types of acts, calling them completely intolerable, reprehensible, and he vowed to investigate and initiate corrective action immediately. Now, anyone reading this report would be left with the impression that this was an isolated incident of overt cruelty, or at the very worst, a regular occurrence isolated to large factory farms. Amidst these cataloged horrors, the troubling implication of a single sentence was easily overlooked. But of course, that's what I focused on. Because following the description of the workers' treatment of pigs, the article stated, Temple Grandin, a leading animal welfare expert who serves as a consultant to the livestock industry, said that while those are standard industry practices, the treatment of the sows on the video was far from it. This is atrocious animal abuse, Grandin said. So to be clear, the treatment of the mother pigs is what Grandin deemed atrocious animal abuse. The acts that she was waving away as standard industry practice were the unanesthetized mutilation of newborn piglets and the brutal and ineffective slamming of defective piglets against the concrete floor. And she was not wrong, because these are not only are those practices legal, they're government sanctioned methods within, but not limited to, the United States, Canada, and the European Union. So within my essay, I implored the reader to ask themselves, were you to have watched that video and heard the piercing screams of the mother pigs and their babies, would you have spotted the difference between the atrocious animal abuse and the standard industry practice? You know, when we fail to explain and emphasize that the horrors depicted in these videos are not only legal, but government-sanctioned, humane legislation dictated practices, we leave the public with the impression that this was the result of a few malicious sociopathic workers or poorly regulated facilities, just a few bad apples. So far from considering veganism, the public is left thinking that luckily these perpetrators were exposed and surely they're going to be punished. And thank goodness that the eggs, the meat, and the dairy that I eat isn't contributing to that kind of abusive behavior. Invariably, when these horrific acts are exposed to the public, there's a call for stronger regulations and higher welfare standards. And as activists and vegans in general, we can become caught in this self-perpetuating cycle, believing that we're fighting for progress when we're simply running in place. So an example of this cycle is the rise of cage-free eggs. I recently published an article, video, and e-course on cage-free eggs, which you can find at bitesizevegan.org/cagefree if you want to check it out. And as always happens when I dive into researching a topic, even one that I've previously covered, I find so much new information. As I've stated in several videos and speeches that cage-free hens have been shown to have twice the mortality rate of battery caged hens. And this is a seemingly damning indictment of the idea that such humane labels as cage-free are improvements for animals. But when I began researching this statistic, I found that it was far more complicated. After coming across a meta-analysis that seemed to indicate that mortality rates have been on the decline worldwide in cage-free systems, such that the difference between caged and non-caged hens is nearly non-existent, I worried that this worked against the point that I've been making in the past. But something that I find so incredibly important in my activism is to never shy away from new information. Even if it seems like it may go against what I'm aiming to say, it's so important to evaluate and present what's true. And invariably, once I go deeper into research, I find that what may initially seem to be a contradiction or something in support of an agricultural practice, in reality, the underlying truth of anything in the animal products industry cannot help but be problematic. So I'd like to take you through my own journey with researching the question of hen mortality rates in different housing systems, at least in brief. So let me take a drink of water real quick. Laying hens were originally moved into battery cages for a number of reasons, including profit and management-oriented benefits such as reduced labor requirements, greater efficiency of space because they could fit more chickens into the same space, and lower feed requirements. However, there were also perceived benefits to the hens, including a reduction in disease transference, injurious pecking, and cannibalism. So as the demand for cage-free systems rose, multiple studies found that the mortality rate in these non-cage systems was higher than battery cage systems due to these very issues, meaning increased disease transference, increased injurious pecking, and cannibalism. One of the more comprehensive studies that I had quoted in the past found that cage-free hens had 2.5 times higher mortality rate than battery caged hens. And to be clear though, that finding was not isolated to that study or even to one country. So it would seem that cage-free eggs actually result in more deaths than conventional battery cages. However, in more recent years, researchers have pointed out that the reason for higher mortality rates may not have anything to do with the housing system per se. Instead, the rates appear more reliably tied to the genetic strain of hens within the facility, the experience level of the managing staff, and whether the flocks are debeaked. So these researchers argue that as producers have become more familiar with managing non-cage systems and have started using more appropriate breeds, the mortality rates have been on the decline, and they believe this decline will continue. At first glance, I was worried that I'd been conveying faulty data, that perhaps the decline in mortality rates in non-cage systems was a promising trend in support of such humane labels as cage-free eggs. But the more I read, the more I found that rather than pointing to reasons for hope, the causes of the mortality decline actually highlighted the reality that within the animal products industry, the solutions are the problems. And what I mean by this is that every time our breeding, confinement, mutilation, and slaughter of non-human animals invariably cause ethical, environmental, and health problems, we strive to solve them with different variations of breeding, confinement, mutilation, and slaughter. And we continue this cycle over and over again, addressing these problems of our own creation with solutions that will eventually become our next problem, rather than ever stepping back and questioning our use of animals in the first place. So when hens injure and kill one another due to their breeding and living conditions, both of which we have imposed upon them, the solution is to cut off their beaks and further alter their breeding. This has happened before in the reverse. So in Denmark, laying hens were not moved into cages until 1980. And at the time, the dominant breed of hens was adapted specifically for non-cage systems. When moved into cages, their mortality rate increased 5 times over. So this is the same trend that we saw when moving hens bred for battery cages into non-caged environments, only even more pronounced. But the problem isn't really the housing or the label or the stocking density or whatever we want to point to. The problem is us and how we relate to these beings. I also want to note, in all of the research that I came across about mortality rates not being down to the housing system, the importance of debeaking hens to reduce the injurious pecking and the cannibalism was strongly emphasized. So even if using the appropriate breed of hen and having more experienced management, whether the flock was debeaked or not, often was the deciding factor in mortality rates. And of course, debeaking is a painful mutilation in which a portion of a bird's sensitive beak is cut or burned off. And I came across a statement from Ian J.H. Duncan, Professor Emeritus and Emeritus Chair in Animal Welfare at the University of Guelph, Canada, that illustrates this predicament. So he said, if producers do not trim beaks, then feather pecking and cannibalism may cause enormous suffering. If they do trim beaks by conventional methods, the birds will suffer from acute and chronic pain. Chopping off parts of young animals in order to prevent future welfare problems is a very crude solution. Of course, though, he proposed instead that likely the long-term solution to the problem was going to be a genetic one. And while certainly less objectionable than debeaking on a visceral level, the genetic manipulation of sentient beings to serve our purposes is not only extremely ethically problematic, but once again, what got us into this position in the first place. So when we, as activists or vegans, push for animal welfare reform and higher standards and better regulations, we are participating in this cycle. We are participating in a system that's built upon a faulty and unethical premise that animals are ours to use, and that there is a right and acceptable way to use them. That the solution to their suffering is to further control and manipulate their very beings. So, after covering a lot of examples of what not to say in our activism, I thought I would touch upon some approaches of what to say and how to say it, as well as ways to remove common barriers that can arise when speaking with non-vegans. Overall, as activists, we have to stay focused on the universal truth underlying any use of sentient beings. That even if we imagine an idealized small farm where animals are given ample space outdoors and their every need is cared for, there will still come a time when their life is cut short. Their entire existence is still based upon an owner-product framework. Their value is not viewed as inherent, but rather calculated down to the dollar. One way of effectively cutting to this core truth for non-vegans is to place it within a familiar emotional framework. So we may have them envision this idealized farm, but imagine in the place of the happy farmed animals, a beloved pet. And then we can ask them, would it be acceptable to end their pet's life? What if it was guaranteed that they wouldn't feel a thing? It was going to be quick and humane. Instantly, the unacceptability of this is clear at a visceral level. And from that connection, we can explore with them, what is the difference between your pet and the sentient beings of the food industry? Do they not also feel pain and fear? You know, we can even give an example within an industry of when a mother cow in the dairy industry cries out for her calf taken from her so that she'll produce more milk for humans. Is that not a mother grieving? And when she is sexually violated yet again to induce yet another pregnancy and give birth to yet another child who will yet again be taken, how can that not take an emotional and physical toll? I mean, there is a reason that dairy cows' bodies generally give out when they're 4 to 5 years old, despite having a natural lifespan of 20 years or more. You might find that applying such emotionality to non-human animals can be criticized as anthropomorphic. But this is an objection that actually illustrates the contradiction of humane concepts. Humane regulations are an inherent admission of an animal's ability to suffer and feel pain. So how can we claim that our animals are healthy and happy, but then deny that they possess those capacities when we're asked to see from their perspective? We simply just cannot have it both ways. And this is a helpful way of illustrating how profoundly illogical our thinking is when it comes to animals. Knowing better, but doing wrong anyways, is worse than having no knowledge. Yet time and again, we have the audacity to hold legislative recognition of non-human sentience on high as this giant step forward for the rights of animals, as if systematically exploiting individuals with fully admitted knowledge and comprehension of their capacity to suffer is something to commend. Highlighting this faulty logic and focusing on the fundamental truth that we've all known since childhood, that it's not okay to hurt others, cuts through all of the convoluted justifications and diversions, allowing people to reconnect with their own values. Now, as I stated in the opening of this speech, activists and vegans often fall into the trap of offering gradations of change or humane alternatives when seeking a more approachable entry point for non-vegans. I've long believed that one of the main reasons people don't go vegan is the immense pain and guilt of accepting our part in horrific atrocities. Confronting the true impact of our choices is incredibly daunting. So instead, we shut down, attack, or throw out a number of standard objections that you've maybe heard, like lions or desert islands, or what about my protein? And it's just human nature to raise our guards when we're on the defensive. We close off and we shut down. So it would seem logical as activists to avoid upsetting our audience in order to keep their receptivity open. However, this is a perfect illustrative example of walking the line, because it's not about making sure not to upset anyone. If they are grasping the truth, they should be upset. It's making sure that the pushback to the truths we reveal are aimed at the rightful sources, leading to constructive, well-deserved outrage. So when we present them with solid factual information about the industries in an educational setting, we can supply a buffer of sorts, providing a target for their outrage other than themselves. And this can help sidestep the shutdown and channel their outrage into action. I do want to note that this is not an attempt to excuse any participation in exploitation. When I speak to a non-vegan audience, I always tell them that they deserve to know the truth about what they're putting in their body, about what they're feeding to their children. They deserve to know how what they eat impacts their planet, and that they certainly deserve to know what they are paying others to do to animals in their name. Approaching vegan outreach from this perspective helps diffuse the charge of defensiveness and resistance. There's no need to pander or sugarcoat or offer more palatable outlets. I simply present them with factual evidence, allowing them to evaluate whether they want to continue supporting actions that are out of line with their values. Another barrier that I strive to eliminate in my activism is issues of trust. There are many reasons that non-vegans may dismiss the vegan message, not the least of which is the messenger. And this is why when I speak with non-vegans, I'm sure to present information put forth by their own agricultural industries or governmental bodies. This not only helps diffuse a potential defensive charge of some random vegan person telling them how bad things are, but it also allows them, or allows me to show that even the proposed ideal, which of course is never met, is absolutely horrifying. This is a particularly important approach when speaking to audiences in other countries or cross-culturally. When I spoke in Dublin, Ireland, I dove deep into the humane legislation of both Ireland and the EU. Ireland is a powerful case study. It's essentially the humane concept embodied in country form. Cows graze outside in picturesque fields, lending support to the common refrain that, well, it's not like that here. And by all appearances, it's not. Even after some digging, I only found a single undercover video of abuse. But I didn't want to focus on abuse. I wanted to focus on the ideal standards. And I told the audience that the facts that I'll present today are not of my creation. I've sourced them from primarily Irish governmental and industry documents and the European Union. And I told them that they didn't have to believe me, because I provided them a link to a full transcript of the talk with citations for every fact that I stated and a bibliography. And this not only provides an opportunity for further learning, but it also removes the significant potential barrier of requiring someone to trust in me personally about issues, on issues about which they are already guarded. So as animal activists, we don't have to fear presenting the bare facts. We don't have to try to sensationalize or exaggerate. The truth is bad enough. The ideal, the very best we have to offer is bad enough. And more importantly, we do not need to and should not compromise the integrity of our ethics in an effort to make veganism more approachable. When we do so, we're supporting the very things that we're fighting against. We don't have to fear sharing the truth with others. It's not only vital for the sentient beings we are defending, but it's also the most respectful approach for the non-vegan with whom we're speaking, because they deserve to know, and they deserve to make a choice with all of the facts at their disposal. I hope that this has been a helpful exploration the importance of language in activism. And thank you again for having me.
Oh, thank you, Emily. You can stop the recording, Justin.
Okay.